When he returned the creature, Refo was ready for him, or at least he thought he was. When he returned, he brought with him another, someone also hooded, and their face shrouded in shade, the only part of it visible, one eye in the flickering torchlight, one red eye. And Refo knew that it was her, the she-demon that had brought him to this place, had teleported him probably for all he knew. What magics did she know? What secret incantation had she? But Refo stopped his maddened thinking for a moment, his rage boiling over himself, so to speak, and stared at her, and to his surprise he was not affected by her gaze. At least, not that he could notice. No, in fact, he was ready to speak with her, but when he did, he found that what he spoke was not what he had thought to speak, and it was as if someone had taken hold of his being somehow, and his voice, though not this creature. "Do not kill me," Refo stated plainly and as harshly as he could manage. "We may," she cooed, "but perhaps not," she added before taking the blade from the other's hand. Raising it, she placed it beneath Refo's chin, forcing him to tilt his head back and to arch his back further, a most uncomfortable position to be in. "Tell me," she continued, "tell me what it is you have to offer." "Whatever you want," Refo muttered in disgust. "I have it." She withdrew the knife and then grabbed a hold of his chin with her palm. "Look at me, Refo," she said. Refo, afraid now, shut his eyes quickly. "Look at me," she repeated. Refo opened his eyes abruptly, looking away from her. "What for?" She grinned. "Do as I say, and you might just make it out of here in one piece, or," she said, "many pieces." Jorgen exhaled angrily. Refo exhaled angrily. "Tell me where Jorgen is." But before he could finish, the knife blade was pointed back at his throat. "Careful," she cooed. "We didn't say you could have him, too," Refo breathed, blinking twice. "Just tell me what it is you want." She removed the blade and leaned in. "I want you to look at me." Refo gulped and nodded, the fear of it seeping through him. "All right." He looked and everything disappeared. When he awoke, Refo did not know where he was, but he was alone, and in a clearing in the forest. He was naked, of course, as those beasts had taken his clothing, and for it he had caught a great chill, and he knew that if he did not find some sort of shelter, and quickly, he would surely catch a frost. He would need to return to the carriage, but which direction he did not know. Stumbling, he stood as the cold ground bit at his bare feet. He began to shiver, and he thought that surely he would here die instead, where before he thought he would die at the edge of a knife blade, but no matter. He stumbled forward and, taking a look around the clearing, noticed something on its edge, but what at first it was he could not see, as his vision had blurred, but for whatever reason it could have been a spell. It could have been the cold, he could not tell, but nonetheless, what he could tell was that there was something, and it was moving. Not quickly, but slowly, and as it moved, Refo's vision returning, he could see that it was something human. "Another vampire, perhaps," he muttered, yet shivering. Let them do their worst." But as his vision returned to clarity, and as the clearing became smaller, as he walked closer to the moving object or animal, whatever it was, he finally noticed that it was indeed a person, a large person, a man. "Grandin," Refo sighed. Without pause, Grandin Obscurus walked away from the edges of the forest and into the clearing, making himself fully visible. Refo had forgotten, it seemed, just how large the man actually was, and, naked in the clearing, shivering, Refo could not help but feel exposed, to say the least. "Refo Rocumulus," Grandin said, looking serious. "Grandin," Refo muttered back. "Funny meeting you here." Refo raised an eyebrow and nodded. "'Tis." "Does your father know you're searching for me?" Refo shook his head, looking down at the ground. "He doesn't." "Good," Grandin said, and then curtly ushered him towards the forest. "My camp is not far. There are clothes there you may wear." Refo took a chilled breath and followed Grandin, relieved that he had said no more, whose men made themselves visible as soon as Refo followed in step. There were dozens of them, which seemed like many, and they were armed with rifle, pistol, and sword, each of them. They laughed at Refo as he shivered, some of them, whilst others remained more serious, and yet others remained on edge and alerted. They moved through the forest almost as silently as as those beasts had, and though Refo wanted to ask about them to ask Grandin was moving at such a pace and at such a stride that Refo could hardly keep up with him, let alone get a word in edgewise, so to speak, let alone begin a conversation. Besides, there were other questions to ask, many questions, not to mention Jorgen, who he would surely recapture. And Refo had many questions. Who were these men? Grandin's men, obviously, or they followed him anyhow. What were the creatures that had captured him? An obvious enough question to ask, assuming that Grandin knew anything of these creatures, which, given the men and the firepower, it would seem that he did. And of course, the last question: what had happened to his mother? To Refo's mother, though Refo would not ask the last, as he knew that should Grandin have had anything to do with the death or murder of his dead mother, he would assuredly want to keep his mouth shut over it for the time being. He had the sense even, however, that although he might bring up the question of his mother's death, he might also himself receive silence from Grandin Obscurius, or an intelligent dodge and misdirection of the question, all of which Refo was inclined to avoid. Yet no matter, they had arrived at the camp, and Grandin, he was tired, everyone could see that. His face was rough, his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and black as his hair, and his beard larger than it had seemed at the banquet. Refo, he said doggedly, come here and sit with me, he said, as he sat on a large stump around a fire where a few roughened men sat, roasting meat and eating cheeses. They too looked quite tired, though none as exhausted as Grandin Obscurius did seem. He rubbed his eyes, and as Refo sat, Refo thought that Grandin would surely bark something at him, some criticism or order or whatever else. He did not. Instead, rubbing his eyes, he sighed and did say, "Your friend, Refo," he said, pausing as a man placed clothes next to Refo. "I don't know his name." "Jorgen?" Refo said. "Yes, that must be him," Grandin said, clearly troubled, a side of himself that Refo had not been privy to at the banquet. "What of him?" Refo said, concerned as any good friend would be. "We found him." "You found him?" Refo said. "Where? Where is he?" Grandin wiped his face as if it were muddied, and looking down at his large hands, which were interlinked in front of him like a giant club of sorts, stated, "We found him hanging from one of the trees nearest our camp." "Hanging," Refo said, his thoughts turning to confusion and rage. "Here," Grandin tried to explain as delicately as he could, "here the dead men swing." A moment passed. Grandin nodded. "We cut him down. We will burn and bury him tonight." Refo nodded solemnly. His shivering had ceased, but there was no tear in his eye. "Where?" He took a breath. "Where is he?"